like to welcome you to the second lecture in what is a year-long lecture series celebrating the 50th anniversary of the creation of the Department of African and African American Studies, Black Studies here at Duke. We are honored to welcome Dr. Courtney Baker, who is a specialist on the impact of visual culture in Black life. She's associate professor in the Department of English at the University of California at Riverside. Previously, she was associate professor of American Studies at Occidental College and the inaugural chair and co-founder of the college's Black Studies program. She obtained her Ph.D. from the literature program here at Duke University, undergraduate degree from Harvard in women's studies. Her book, which we do have copies of for purchase if you don't have one already, Humane Insight, Looking at the Images of African American Suffering and Death, was published. And the New Black Studies series, edited by Darlene Clark Hine and Dwight McBride, who, if you don't know, was just literally 3 days ago announced as the new president of the new school. And this is a series published by the University of Illinois Press. She has written academic and popular essays on African American film, the history of the image of African American activism, and the ethics of narratives about death. She teaches courses on Black film, African American literature, race and ethnicity, and in American studies, cultural studies, and critical theories on the human and visual. Her current research project is on film formalism in 21st century Black film, and she's also fairly close to us this year as a James Weldon Johnson Fellow at Emory University. Professor Courtney Baker.
Thank you so much, in particular to AAAS and Mark for inviting me back to the old stomping ground that bears almost no resemblance to what it looked like when I was last here. It's really an incredible, it's an incredible honor, and I'm really indebted to a number of people in this room for their friendship, their mentorship, their work. Juanima Lubiano, Priscilla Wald, my friend Lenice Williams, Cindy Current, Mark Rifkin, who in my evolution of my thinking, I'm coming more and more into conversation with in terms of Native studies, which I will give some very cursory nods to today. Recognizing also that today is Indigenous Peoples Day, and also Rick Powell. Yeah, there are a number of people who are here and who aren't here, who, like Carla Holloway, Maurice Wallace, Jan Radway, who are really, the work that I have conducted for Humane Insight, and the kind of threads of that project, its investment in visual culture and ethics and Black life, mean to honor and carry that on. So thank you, mostly Black Duke, and Black adjacent Duke, because there's a difference, right? Which is one of the things that I want to talk about. So the goals of my talk today are to kind of give a sense of my past work and abiding concerns, to describe the interventions, the conversations that I'm trying to have, the thread that tracks through my prior book and this new book, which is tentatively entitled Tyranny of Realism, and to also situate my thinking in relation to some of the major tenets and principles of Black studies, or to use Moten's formulation, which I'll talk directly about a little bit, Black study, because this seems really crucial to mark this 50th anniversary, which is really a significant anniversary of AAAS at Duke. And lastly, before I launch in, I want to dedicate this talk to Tatiana Jefferson, who was killed last night by a police officer who shot into her Fort Worth home after a neighbor called the police to check on her household's well-being. So, since much of my recent work has been on an administrative front, as I led the project to revamp Africana Studies at Connecticut College and build Black Studies at Occidental College with my colleague, the historian Erica Ball, and especially since I'm here to help mark this anniversary, where my serious scholarship on the study of Black life began, I want to situate my remarks in relation to Black study, its intellectual promise, its institutional precarity, they're not here, hopefully, and its abiding instruction in just what we think this academic enterprise is anyway. I also want to mark this Indigenous Peoples Day with more than a nod to the traditional caretakers of this land, the Anoke, the Catawba, and the Saponi peoples, and to bring to the table the conjoined wisdom of Black and Indigenous study as they light the path towards our liberation. So there's kind of a 3-act structure, more or less, to this talk. I'll begin with the critical and theoretical frameworks that most captivate me and that carry through in humane insight and into the current project, which is on Blackness and film formalism. So the frameworks, then I'll talk a little bit about humane insight, especially for those of you who haven't encountered that book, and then how my thinking has evolved and what I'm thinking about now, which is still Black, still visual, and at least in the part that I'm presenting, still about violence. All right. So the significance of Black study within my work as a researcher and as administratively bringing to fruition 2 programs in Black studies in higher education has made me incredibly aware of the degree to which Black study is not always legible within the academy and can actually be perceived as hostile to the academy. And some of that recognition of hostility is for good reason. Insofar as Black study tends to challenge disciplinary boundaries, bringing together fields of studies deemed discrete by the Western Academy, like music and literature, for instance, or performance and history. Black study also challenges the authority of the university's own boundaries of inside and outside communities of knowledge. As many know, Black studies has always resisted the territorialization of knowledge through kind of the trope of the public-facing intellectual, but also by other means, that excludes those outside of the academy as knowing less or nothing at all about those things that constitute our objects of study within the academy. Black study, as I understand it, acknowledges that the academy has taken little interest historically in Black people, and that when it has supplied incredible misreadings and biased reports on the realities of Black life. Consequently, conducting Black study within the academy means introducing into the academy Black traditions and practices of knowledge production. It means divesting from the authority of the academy in order to expose its oversights and introduce the genius of Black traditions of knowing for the purposes of expanding and improving upon the knowledge project inaugurated by liberal humanism. In his article, Black Op, Fred Moten defines Black study, something that he distinguishes from Black studies, as, quote, a dehiscence at the heart of the institution and on its edge, end quote. He adds that, quote, Black studies' concern is with what it is to own one's dispossession, to mind what is held in having been possessed, as this makes it more possible to embrace the underprivilege of being sentenced to the gift of constant escape, end quote. Insofar as Moten's discussion of Black studies' politics of relation foregrounds possession and location as principal logics, I'm inspired to think of the relationship that Black study has to Indigenous studies. This impulse to escape possession, a form of institutional drapetomania, would seem to be at odds with Indigenous studies' drive toward the restorations of possessions. However, these seemingly divergent vectors are bound together by the suspicious eye, both turn towards the academy. A look that is warranted, if not required, to maintain a modicum of self-determination within the current moment in which the university is privileged as the proper site of knowledge production over and against the Maroon Society, the ghetto, and the Native Reservation, all of which are, after all, communes and commons by another name. In Native and Indigenous studies, the term survivance holds a particular currency that resonates with the self-preservationist project of Black studies. Anishinaabe and Chippewa scholar Gerald Weisner defines survivance as, quote, the heritable right of succession, and identifies, quote, survivance stories as renunciations of dominance, detractions, obstructions, the unbearable sentiments of tragedy, and the legacy of victimry, end quote. I appreciate Weisner's language here for the way that it pushes back against immiseration as a defining quality of Native existence, a gesture that I find desirable for Black study as well. This notion of survivance can be brought to bear on a Black study and life that is not opposed to Indigenous study and life, and vice versa. It might help to think of Blackness as indigeneity forced to exist elsewhere. Such a logic further justifies the link between Black study and Native study and their currently furtive and fugitive articulations of life beyond death. One of the most influential, but certainly not only, projects of thinking Black and Indigenous studies hinges upon the visual, and in particular the cinematic, as sites where discourses of African American and Native American identity have been articulated. I'm thinking, of course, of Frank Wilderson's 2010 volume, Red, White, and Black, Cinema and the Structures of U.S. Antagonisms. I'm going to use Wilderson's text here as a point of entry, albeit a problematic one, as I will explain, into the importance of visual thinking and critique in what I have termed in the title of this talk, liberation aesthetics. My thinking of Black study alongside Native study is at odds with Wilderson's death-bound Afro-pessimist formulation of suffering as the nodal point upon which Black and red, to use his terms, grammars of identity exist and diverge. Wilderson locates in film discourses that articulate what he frames as important truths of Black and Native conditions, conditions that reform, if not deform, in the cinematic utterance into the slave film and the savage film. While I agree that film and visual culture more generally are important sites of critical resistance for marginalized peoples, in my view, Wilderson's commitment to understand the present as a consequence of a past that leaves the Black subject, quote, socially dead, is a touch too absolutist, reflecting a wider critique of Afro-pessimism, as it is unable to think or uninterested in thinking beyond the now. Wilderson's version of Afro-pessimism places him at odds with the generative logics of what I find to be the most useful characteristics of Afrofuturism, a phenomenon that Black film scholar Elizabeth Reich describes as, quote, expansive in its aesthetic, thematic, and political scope. A transnational, transhistorical, and continually arising form of Black art and expression tied to the political commitment to imagine Black life otherwise, end quote. As a result, for Wilderson, Native sovereignty coheres into a crisis of real estate that excludes the Black diasporan subject. In his reading, Black film is first faced with the problem of, quote, telling the story of a being that has no story, end quote, whereas Native American film, which is not, as he seems to imply, reducible to Indigenous film, is occupied not with the loss of self, but with the loss of possessions, which is to say that it is invested in rather than critical of logics of accumulation. Reading between the lines, I detect a regret and a longing in Wilderson for a Black and red coalition structured around what he calls into being, though he says, I don't see this, a network of connections, transfers, and displacements between red ontological death and Black ontological death. While I'm very interested in the political utility of the discourse of death in particular, believe me, I am invested in it. I wrote a book, I wrote an article, I taught a class, and I'm not done. I am not, however, convinced that figuring death as the bedrock in the articulation of subjugated identities is either politically expedient or what visual artists and activists are really doing when they mobilize images and narratives of death. What I want to do here in my current work, and hope is present in my prior work, is to search for the potential rather than bemoan the shortcomings of efforts to recruit visual practices into a disruption of the logics of anti-Black and anti-red now. So in what follows, I will track the thread of looking at visualized disruptions and irruptions of anti-Black logics in my work, beginning with my book, Humane Insight, before turning to my current book project, Tyranny of Realism, 21st Century Blackness and the Ends of Cinema. So, Humane Insight looks, beyond film to fine art, photographs, and presence, and begins at the dawn of the photographic age in 1834 and ends in 2005, just before what Reich refers to as the Black Lives Matter era, a moment that articulates what she calls the, quote, always already political demand for freedom and repair, shot through with the efforts of protest that have been fundamental to the creation of Black publics, whether viewing audiences, church congregations, slavery resistors, or hashtag Black Lives Matter and other freedom activists. Humane Insight regards death as a feature that frustrates rather than reinforces discourse. It was my dissertation. Written amidst a clamor for Giorgio Agamben and his resuscitation of the death aspect of Michel Foucault's biopolitics, a clamor that tended in some circles to ignore the rich and near simultaneous critique provided by Achille Mbembe in his crucial essay and later book, Necropolitics. Humane Insight attempts to take seriously the popular mobilization of what we might call, nevertheless borrowing Agamben's term, bare life, and African Americans' remarkable proximity to death, something that Carla Holloway's work was really essential for, and to recruit those somehow, ironically, to a pro-Black political aesthetic. I took that out. Written in the wake of the spectacular violences of 9/11, the project was motivated by my frustration with interpretations of visual culture that assign moral, ideological, and political beliefs to the image. I wanted to return such critiques to their proper, what I saw as their proper objects, activist moments and the self, and to call for a more rigorous consideration of what visual counters can enact. Seeking an answer and a precedent, I found myself challenged by the wisdom of activist Mamie Till Mobley, mother of Emmett Till, who I identify alongside Ida B. Wells as an important thinker of how the horrible spectacle of Black suffering and death might be transcoded to consolidate and motivate a pro-Black movement. Humane Insight's look into viewing relations is of necessity historically, spatially, subjectively, and socially inflected. It proceeds from the idea that looking tells us more about ourselves than the image, considered out of its social context, can. My study attempts to elaborate and elongate the contemplation that has too often been reduced to an inaccurate shorthand that takes no notice of the medium or other circumstances of viewing, which is where formalism and also phenomenology became really important ways of thinking through the image. I push back against the sloppy claim that pictures either make us do it or can never make us do anything, the it always being left undefined. When we say that an image causes harm, we are, in fact, I argue, abbreviating a much more complicated narrative about how power plays out in image production, circulation, and reception. In obscuring the labor and affect involved in consuming or being consumed by this image from that time, in this moment, at this time, we fail to attend to the means of production and economies of circulation. Who had the power to produce the image? Who desired its creation? Who were its intended recipients? Under what conditions could it be seen? We are shrinking from exploring the affective labor that particular viewings can afford. Do I, as a viewer, embrace the viewing position that the image invites? Am I moved emotionally, ideologically, or bodily to do something, even if that something is so seemingly slight as to be a rethinking of my prior belief? There are, as you probably noticed in this thinking, influences of Marxist thought, the attention to labor, and of affect theory. Eve Sedgwick's work on shame was essential here. I also wanted to engage with important assertions about the image made by Susan Sontag, Judith Butler, Elizabeth Alexander, and Saidiya Hartman. I wanted, too, to consider how the notion of the visual has fundamentally inflected discussions of humanity, expanding Nancy Armstrong's important historical argument about the image, including racialized humanity in the works of thinkers as seemingly far afield as George Friedrich Hegel and Frantz Fanon. I don't know, that came out weird sounding. Humanity, the term that underpins the investigation, is a fraught concept, having been mobilized within Western liberalism by both humanists and fascists. You can think of Paul Gilroy and his holding on to the term humanity, but also of Carl Schmitt, the Nazi thinker. A point that I sought to make in my book was that even though humanity is an ideological concept with no evidentiary reference, the best we can do is to reference humanness is to refer to a universal vulnerability. But for obvious reasons, thinking of animals, this is not exclusive to humans. So even that is not that necessarily helpful. Nevertheless, humanity has and continues to circulate by proponents of universal human rights to signify a proper set of behaviors and orientations by governments, institutions, and individuals toward human subjects. I write in my book that, quote, the concept of humanity functions quite distinctly in rhetoric. The term and the concept can only ever signal a truth that can be neither proven nor disproven. Humanity is therefore less of a condition than it is an idea that signals to other how those identified as human beings ought to be treated. And yet, this concept of humanity has been essentially contested terrain for African Americans who have sought full recognition ensured by the moniker human. Organized chronologically, in a manner that hopefully illustrates the evolutions, evasions, and competitions in humanist thought within African American liberation struggle, Humane Insight charts shifts in rhetoric and beliefs that have at various times made Black humanity visible by attaching the visual encounter to a project of pain reduction and Black survival. The project therefore compelled me to write across various forms of visual encounter, attending always to the specific forms of mediation, but also acknowledging a critical and philosophical privileging of the visual with respect to Western understandings of the human. And for me, that's where Hegel comes in his notions of intersubjectivity and recognizing the consciousness of the other. I justify this look across different visual encounters by writing, quote, even as evolving visual technologies such as photography, cinema, and digital imaging recode our encounters with spectacular violence, they perpetuate the ethical injunction to bear witness. Though we may indeed access a world no longer, if it ever was, characterized by our access to the actual, but now by our encounter with the simulacrum, as ethical human beings, we continue to make recourse to an image of human respect and dignity, in a word, humanity, to justify and legitimize our living with others. As you can probably tell by my use of the term simulacrum with a sotto voce reference to Jean Baudrillard's theory of the simulacrum, Humane Insight believes that images matter. The book marks a stage in my thinking about the significance of the image, the pervasiveness of representation as a concept denoting a relational structure, underwriting language and reality, and the simultaneity of Blackness as both a theoretical principle and a lived experience. Now, just to, in the briefest of ways, to give those of you who haven't read the book, a more concrete sense of the moves that I make, I'm just going to give you a sense of some of my primary interlocutors, in particular ones who carry over into my current project and will probably always be with me, and my objects of study. So, all right, here we go. So Susan Sontag's final work regarding the pain of others emerged, and I was quite troubled by the assertion that she wrote, perhaps the only people with the right to look at images of suffering of this extreme order are those who could do something to alleviate it or those who could learn from it. The rest of us are voyeurs, whether or not we mean to be. So I wanted to think about that almost automatic kind of condemnation of the role of looking as being a project of voyeurism, which is not what I see Ida B. Wells being interested in, or even the NAACP launching an art exhibition on lynching to be invested in. I was also drawn to Elizabeth Alexander's essay, Can You Be Black and Look at This?, the title of which is drawn from this piece by Pat Ward-Williams, and the title appears here, in which is encased a photograph of a lynching that is itself, we could say, deconstruction. Sure, we're using that word willy-nilly now, but broken down to interrogate and to kind of elongate the project of looking. And in that essay, which attended the exhibition, the Whitney exhibition of the Black Male Show, she writes, "White men have been the primary stagers and consumers of the historical spectacles I have mentioned. But in one way or another, Black people also have been looking, forging a traumatized collective historical memory, a traumatized historical collective historical memory, which is reinvoked at contemporary sites of conflict." So I wanted to think about those moments of reinvocation. And of course, congratulations to Professor Hartman, scenes of subjection, which we are still reckoning with. And she does a number of things in that work, and including one move that is really crucial for me, and another I'll bring up later in my discussion of film, which is to say that pain provides the common language of humanity. It extends humanity to the dispossessed, and in turn remedies the indifference of the callous. So quickly, the objects. So as I said, I start in abolitionist New Orleans with the Lalaurie affair, in 1834, where there was the exposure of a white Creole woman's abuse of enslaved peoples in her attic that, the story goes, drove her out of the city, almost caused a riot, until the newspaper was like, okay, are we really gonna riot for Black life? We are a slave regime. Also, remember Haiti, because that's not that far. But there's an opening there, right, where folks are saying this is horrible. And it is an event that gets circulated in the abolitionist newspaper, and it echoes the project of a lot of the abolitionist tours, which was for the formerly enslaved, the self-emancipated, to expose the wounds on their bodies. And this even includes Frederick Douglass, who writes about that in a rejoinder to someone in his own newspaper. Pressing forward, I compare the different, the logics of the gallery in particular, and of artworks, but also the photograph as a documentary archive in the NAACP mounted an art commentary on lynching in 1935, and later in the 2000 onward to about 2008 traveling show, Without Sanctuary. And talk about the different kind of politics of installation, as well as the different kinds of readings that are available. The kind of through line here is that none of the readings are readings, and the image doesn't guarantee a certain reception. And that's entirely the work, in particular, of anti-lynching exhibitions. I also consider the violences of the civil rights movement, and how really the SCLC, as well as SNCC and the sit-ins, were quite deliberate in staging these performances of violence and submitting their bodies, and also really calling up the news stations to, we're going to have a sit-in, it's going to be violent, want to come see it and broadcast it. That's also has to do with the particular conditions of the television news that really wasn't as invested or didn't have a clear idea of ratings or what the function of the television news was in this dawning of television. And then I conclude by looking at Katrina, which really examining that revealed to me the limitations of this through line of Black activism that mobilizes the image of suffering and death, where suffering and death, surviving the suffering, actually ended up being talked about as a liability that was an opportunity for some to re-articulate their anti-Blackness and to articulate a kind of preference for Black death. It also denotes a shift in the news media and the appearance of the 24-hour news cycle and what we might call infotainment. Okay. So, one way of terming what I'm doing in my work is investigating the politics of representation with respect to Black people. Stuart Hall is the figure I most admire for his consistent appreciation of the connection amongst the image, discourse, and Black lives. If we in this current moment appear to be immersed in an overwhelming environment in which cultural tropes of representation are unable to distinguish between the authentic, called the real, and the scripted, called the fake, or confusingly the representation, then those who are interested in the enmeshment of these terms would do well to examine representations of Blackness, indigeneity, and of African Americans and Native Americans in particular, since we have been, since the inauguration of modernity, the targets of a concerted propaganda campaign to justify our immiseration, tendencies toward death, and the exploitation of our laboring bodies. In other words, the revamped gyrations about the Russians on social media would look a lot less shocking and new if placed alongside a history of dissemblance and denial mobilized against Black and red interests. My research then and now takes the image and the phenomenon of looking to be a serious, pressing matter that affects Black realities today. And if someone wants to convince me otherwise, I will remind them that we have this country elected a reality star president, in part through foreign meddling on social media sites that were scaffolded by circulation networks pioneered by cinema and reality television. And it is in those same realms that both the resistance and the defense of this circumstance is being articulated. So, to my mind, a debilitating shorthand has developed in which social ills are attributed to the image itself, as in the cries that video games cause violence and that the image re-exploits members of the racial or other minority category depicted therein. A case in point was the Dutch instantiation of the Without Sanctuary exhibit. And a European scholar said to me, I think it's terrible because it re-victimizes people. And quietly I thought to myself, but why should Black people feel re-victimized when white people are the ones who did this? I was discomfited in that conversation by the too easy rehearsal of Black subordination and white power that the appearance of these temporally dislocated images suggested in this person's mind. At the same time, I was intrigued by the ambivalence of the image and the mobility of the critique of anti-Black violence that the images made available. I continue to be committed to considering the image as itself inert and ambivalent and available for transcoding. This critical orientation requires me and hopefully my readers to consider the ways that structures of looking at and thinking about images as essential objects of study, and that a serious and sustained analysis of images in relation to laboring bodies can yield more useful and actionable information about how images are set to function in the world. Nothing is embedded in the image. Rather, the image is embedded within, amongst other things, traditions of representation. This conviction has continued in my research and turns upon the radical work of Black study in the academy. My interest in representation brings me into disciplinary formations and traditional formations of art history, film studies, and to even structuralist and post-structuralist theories of representation, in particular semiotics. I don't want to yield those to a non-Black, non-red discourse, a colonial discourse that is unavailable for those of us who seek to overthrow exactly those things. So this work thinks about film formalism as an extremely important terrain for the politics of Black representation. In drawing our attention to form, I mean to contribute to the arguments made by Black film scholars Michael Gillespie and Kara Keeling, and a prior generation of Black film and popular color critical work that encourages us to think of Blackness as itself structured cinematically. I'm intervening here in a long history of Black film criticism that responds to calls made in the 1990s by Toni Cade Bambara to empower the eye, her terms, by developing a critical, deep insight, again, her term, into Black and especially Black feminist signifying practices, and, in the wisdom of Juanima Lubiano, to resist the totalizing and even tyrannical lure of realist readings of Black bodies and stories on screen. In the absence of such deep insight, and in the presence of what I have come to call the tyranny of realism, a number of recent films that take as their subjects Black figures and stories have been cast in popular criticism as failing an unspoken and implicit documentary standard. By contrast, I want to conduct a kind of Bambaran rescue mission by highlighting the unique language of film and lifting up the labor of those who work in and on film. So my work considers Black film not as realistic commentaries, but as industrial artworks in a kind of post-structuralist Derridian sense, where the conditions imposed by cinematic representational structures are played with. It tracks a tradition of messing with the machinery, of understanding Black artistry that is implicated in capitalist industry as the product and work of craftspeople working to imprint originality and innovation upon the mechanically reproduced work of art. So to illustrate what I mean, I'm going to turn now to a reading of the film adaptation of 12 Years a Slave that relies upon an acknowledgement of formal decisions. In arguing for an appreciation of the cinematic medium as itself a terrain of struggle, I seek to draw attention to the limitations and liberties available within cinematic discourse. Attending to the possibilities of film language reveals the work of the long take, a single long-held shot, in conveying the affect of horror that Northup, and indeed many people, believe should attend our visual consumption of spectacles of violence. The film adaptation of 12 Years appears to recognize that performance is the mode of the book's utterance, and think here of performativity and the significance of performance in Saidiya Hartman's work, right? And that the stakes are not to represent reality or history accurately. We can also again think of Hartman and dissembling, but to illustrate through its own vocabulary, the conditions of anti-Black injustice. The representational injustices of the quote-unquote real event linger in the cinematic register. Through its mobilization of form, however, the film version of Northup's true story, and it's kind of not a true story, cannily reveals the limitations of its chosen meetings, but also its promises. So multiple elements, including shot, sound, casting, and framing, permit the film adaptation to function as an emphatically cinematic testimony to the abiding cultures of anti-Blackness and attendant injustices. So upon its release, 12 Years was criticized for its failure to represent African-American survival and endurance. In other words, to represent some kind of Black being. Stanley Crouch, let's roll our eyes, stated that the film, quote, reduced slaves to one-dimensional victims and, quote, put Hollywood attention ahead of the human story it pretended to sell but fell short. Bell Hooks dismissed the film as, quote, sentimental claptrap, which the book might be too. Armand White, reviewing the film in an article entitled Dud of the Week, wrote that in the film, quote, brutality, violence, and misery get confused with history. And that for Black British film director Steve McQueen, quote, brutality is the juicy, arty part, end quote. In addition to bodily pain, the Solomon Northup of both the book and the film endures psychic pain of extreme loneliness. Northup's isolation as someone who is in but not of slavery is portrayed in the film through a canny manipulation of the focal length to depict his standing apart even while standing among his enslaved fellows, something that you see here. Adjustments to the focal length is a purely photographic phenomenon. It is a shift in lenses that is not reproducible in human sight and brings objects in different planes in and out of focus. In multiple scenes throughout the film, the focus isolates Chiwetel Ejiofor as Solomon in a crowd of other Black enslaved subjects and signifies the sense of isolation rather than communion that Northup expresses in the book. Recall, again, that the title is 12 Years a Slave, with the kind of implicit as, right? Slavery being figured here as a performance and condition for Northup, rather than an identity as it is depicted for other characters, such as Patsy in particular. The cinematic Solomon is abused, though never subjected to abuse, as humiliating and dehumanizing as that which Patsy receives. And I'm not going to discuss Patsy's function as a literary and cinematic projection here, though I will in the book. And today I'm going to focus on one scene and how it strives to convey the pain of enduring the tortures of enslavement. In this scene, with which you are perhaps all familiar, Solomon hangs perilously from a noose while other Black people resume their work in the background. The scene recruits the long take as well as the long shots, so duration and composition, to express the banal violence of the plantation pastoral. The scene begins with the expected tropes of horror: tight shots, rapid cuts, a gutting score supplied by a bellowing cello. But once the white antagonism is resolved, for the moment, a quiet Blackness is left. So I'm going to play this and invite you to notice the use of sound, both the score and also the dialogue, and then the shifts into silence. Also notice the high-angle close-ups, and then the move from rapid editing to the kind of static camera and long shot, and the kind of affect that those indicate.
Gentlemen, whoever moves that nigger's a dead man. I am the overseer on this plantation. William Ford holds the mortgage on Platt. If you hang him, he will lose his debt. You have no claim to his life. As for you two, if you have any regard for your own safety, I say be gone!
You got no cause! The Platt is mine, and mine to do with as I please! You touch.
the score just drops away, right? Okay, thanks for indulging. It's because I'm talking about duration, it's actually worthwhile to see how long the scene is. I also apologize for the grain of it. It's working with images, especially ones that have copyright restrictions on them, is annoying. So this is going to play a little more quietly, but I'm going to talk about things that I want to draw attention to in the scene. So the close-up of feet shuffling in mud is ornamented by nothing but the ambient noise of that muddy moisture, loud insects, and Solomon's gagging. When the film cuts to this long shot of Solomon awkwardly suspended from the noose, the pastoral black background is slowly populated by quiet, black enslaved people. As Kevin Quashie helps us understand, quote, quiet is a metaphor for the full range of one's inner life, one's desires, ambitions, hungers, vulnerabilities, fears. It is hard to see, even harder to describe, but no less potent in its ineffability, end quote. So contrary to Crouch's impression of a lack of dimension, Solomon's forced silence, his dehumanization, appears to be answered by a silence that is also fully human, embodied, and resounding, when finally one of the enslaved women alleviates the excruciating silence by offering Solomon some water. It is only this human and humane gesture that somewhat relieves us viewers from the horror of this remarkably banal torture. Solomon and his fellows' situatedness for white supremacist display calls to mind Eastman Johnson's 1859 genre painting, Negro Life in the South, which depicts a far less horrific scene from life of enslaved black people being unknowingly scrutinized by a white woman viewer in the lower right corner. It is similarly invested in the environmental beauty that belies the horror of enslavement. The white woman who enters from the right is acknowledged by no one but the dog, seeming to confirm the just availability of blackness to the white gaze. Contrasting the stillness of the scene to the fury that white invasion of black space precipitates in Toni Morrison's Beloved, Avery Gordon writes that, quote, in this painting, nobody seems to move at all, except perhaps to create a still life, to hold still in an image, an imagined scene of what the white woman wants and needs to see as she crosses the threshold into the painting, end quote. The history of the painting's own politics of display are themselves fascinating, as historian John Davis has observed, given the site of the yard was inspired by Johnson's neighborhood in Washington, D.C., rather than the Deep South that the title suggests. Moreover, Davis remarks that this painting was produced shortly after Johnson's return to Washington in 1855, which he notes was, quote, the same year that saw the sensational trial of a Washington slaver for a slave trader for the kidnapping of a free black, Solomon Northup. The film adaptation of Northup's story appears to engage the logics of the painting's abolitionist aims, but also works to undermine the pleasures of the white gaze by recruiting the techniques of the cinematic medium, image, duration, and sound, to permit the scene to unfold over time with synchronous and non-synchronous, non-diegetic sound. The cinematic long take elongates the display, and of necessity the performance of stillness itself as a form of brutality. In the film, Solomon enacts the life-saving discipline and suffering that must attend holding the pose for the pleasure of white consumption. The film offers to 21st century audiences a commentary on the staging of black performance under a regime of white supremacist brutality. In so doing, it underscores in the cinematic medium Saidiya Hartman's essential observation that, quote, the crimes of slavery are not only witnessed, but staged. Departing from the film's detractors, then, I want to insist that the film version of 12 Years is, like the book, an expression of black being, as it is located within regimes of visual representation. And it is so not because it strives toward the documentary, but because, like the book, it recruits and navigates, denies and affirms knowledge of black being as an attempt to escape capture, whether that captivity is bondage or performance, or as Hartman tells us, always necessarily both. The burden set before 12 Years or any representation of black life is not then one of fidelity and accuracy. I'm gonna skip talking about that in depth, but we can come back to it. But one of justice and dignity, with an incidental commentary on the insufficiency of the very strategies of representation upon which we rely. The distrust of a higher, hegemonic truth that can be culled from capital H history was presaged by no lesser figure than the preeminent historian John Hope Franklin, who, writing on another film, the 1915 adaptation of The Birth of a Nation, wrote, quote, the study of the past may mean many things to many people. For some, it means that the effort to reconstruct what actually happened in an earlier era demands an honesty and integrity that elevate the study of history to a noble enterprise. For some, it means that the search for a usable past provides instructions that may help to avoid the errors of their forefathers. It is not necessary to enumerate each of the many uses of the past, but it is worth noting that not all such quests are characterized by a search for the truth. We would do well then to note that history is not the only terrain of contestation. Black film and visual culture do not need to hew to popular truths in order to be good. Rather, they need to tell their own truths, the truths of their production, of their conditions, and of their limitations and possibilities. And they need good readers who are willing to get out from under the tyranny of realism, to recognize the ways in which black artistry speaks to the truth of black lives on its own terms. If we continue to vilify particular representations of black experience and subjectivity, we will, I fear, be left with dangerously few genres and platforms in which we were able to represent and speak about the complexity and inherent value of black lives. So to conclude, I'm going to juxtapose two folks who I don't mean to mitigate in any way working on film or equate working on film to the loss of a son, but to say that this is serious work, and I mean that this is getting serious, right? If Fred Moten locates and identifies as important sites for black studies, the ship's hold and the undercommons, I want to add that it's also in the sitting rooms and the morgue and in the funeral parlor and on the witness stand, all sites that Till Mobley occupied, as well as on screen, behind the camera, and in the writer's room, that liberationist work is occurring. In closing, I want to advocate for a radical deterritorialization of these spaces as ones where black, white, and red properly and improperly belong. I want to deterritorialize formalism in particular as a critical location that has nothing to offer black and indigenous peoples in our quests for autonomy and the determinations of our futures. To the contrary, film, visual art, and criticism, in addition to the undercommons, can and should be understood as sites of labor where we can recognize and mobilize the terms of expressing black and native liberation and being and bend them toward justice. Thank you.